Welcome again. It's great to have you back to see for yourself. This is session 2. I hope you've managed to read the first 5 chapters of Mark's Gospel and jotted down any questions that might have jumped out at you. In the first session, we looked at the claim that Jesus is the Son of God. We examined the evidence Mark provides to back up this claim, namely Jesus' power or authority. And we saw that the natural conclusion is that this man can do what only God can do. He displays to us the power of God, and he reveals to us the person of God. As the Son of God, he is both fully man and fully God. And that's the first leg of the 3-legged stool to picture the Christian faith. In this session, we're looking at Jesus as the Messiah, or the Christ. Remember that Mark said in his Gospel that it's the good news about Jesus the Messiah. Now what does that mean? Well, it has the idea of a rescuer. Remember how the Bible begins with God creating a perfect world. Of course, that's not how we experience it today, with pain and sadness, and separation and death. The Bible explains how that came about through human beings disobeying God's kind rule and choosing to go their own way. But God promised a rescuer, a human born of a woman who would put things right. And down through the centuries, the prophets began to speak of him as Messiah, God's chosen king, or Christ, who would heal and restore his people. And so faithful Jews held out hope of the Messiah appearing to bring in God's good kingdom. Now let's see for yourself by turning first of all to Mark chapter 8, verse 27 to 33. Here, Jesus asks his disciples who people are thinking and saying he is. They reply, well, some say you're John the Baptist. Some say you're Elijah or one of the prophets. But what about you? Who do you say I am? Jesus asks. Peter, who's usually the spokesman for them all, replies, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus agrees. But immediately he explains that as a Messiah, he must suffer, be killed, and rise again. Now, Peter can't accept that, so he ends up rebuking Jesus. You see, that's not the kind of Messiah Peter had in mind. So, why was Jesus crucified? Now that's a crucial question, because if Jesus was the Son of God and used his power to do so much good, how come he ended up being killed on a cross? Was it a tragedy? A terrible mistake? Or was it according to some kind of plan? Jesus' death on a cross is central to uncovering the meaning of Christianity. That's why the cross has become the symbol of the Christian church. It's recognized all over the world. But what actually happened during the hours Jesus hung on the cross? And what does his death mean? Well, again, I want you to see for yourself by turning to Mark chapter 15 now. And in that chapter you can read how Jesus was condemned by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. He was mocked by the Roman soldiers. He was nailed to a cross at 9 a.m. in the morning. And he was mocked by the Jewish rulers and the crowds. And you might think, well, so what? Thousands of people were executed in the same way by the Romans. What makes Jesus' death so special? That's a good question. Mark gives us Three facts that help us understand the significance of Jesus' death. Firstly, there's the darkness. Look at verse 33. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. What did this darkness at midday mean? One writer says, it's impossible to explain the origin of this darkness. The Passover moon was then at the full, so that it could not have been an eclipse. The Pharisees had often asked for a sign from heaven, and now one was granted to them. The moon, you see, was a full moon at this time, and that means it couldn't have been an eclipse of the sun. In the Old Testament, darkness is often a sign of God's anger against sin or evil. And so the question is, who is God's anger directed against? Who is he angry with as the darkness covers the earth? The second sign is the cry. Look at verse 34 to 37. At 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now this is astonishing. Remember that at Jesus' baptism, God the Father spoke from heaven and said, you are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased. But now Jesus is crying out in anguish and asking God, why have you forsaken me? Now some people have thought that Jesus is losing faith in his God because of the suffering he's experiencing, as though this is not what he had planned. But remember that Jesus had told his disciples that this was the plan, for him to suffer and die. So what's going on? Firstly, Jesus is quoting the first line of a song from the Old Testament, Psalm 22. You can read it for yourself. The experiences of that song are being fulfilled in Jesus. And this suggests that Jesus' sufferings were actually all part of God's plan. And secondly, Jesus' cry of anguish is because he's being forsaken by God his Father for the first time. That God is showing actually anger towards Jesus his Son, although he's done nothing to deserve it. Now why would God do that? And why would Jesus agree to this? Well, look what happens next. The third sign is the curtain. Verse 38. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Now, what was this curtain all about? Well, it was in the temple, and it represented a barrier between the people and the presence of God. Only the high priest could go through that curtain into God's presence. And that was only once a year, and only after the sacrifice of an animal. The curtain then was like a big symbol telling us that we can't get near to God, that he is too holy, and we are too wicked. And that's our problem. Keep away, keep out, the curtain said. But when Jesus dies, that curtain is torn from top to bottom. It's another supernatural event. And it suggests to us that Jesus is the sacrifice. He is dying so that people like us can enter and get near to God. And God is saying, come in, draw near because of what my Son has done. Now this makes sense when we remember something Jesus said earlier about his death on the cross. If you turn to chapter 10 and verse 45, we see here the idea of the ransom. Jesus had kept telling his followers that he would end up dying on a cross, but he also explained that his death wasn't an accident, that there was a purpose in his death. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, a ransom is a payment to set people free. A few years ago, a shipping company paid $9 million to Somali pirates as a ransom to set the ship and the crew free. Jesus is explaining that his suffering and death wasn't pointless. It had a purpose, that he was dying as a sacrifice to set many people free. And if we follow Jesus' teaching in Mark, we'll see that he spoke about forgiveness, the forgiveness of sins. Now, if you forgive someone, you set them free. But forgiveness comes at a cost. We need to be set free from God's judgment, from what we deserve for breaking God's law. And Jesus, through his death, is paying the price for our forgiveness by taking the judgment himself. This really does show astonishing love. Love from Jesus, who was willing to suffer and die, and love from God, the Father, who was willing to punish his own Son instead of people like us. So, in session 1 we saw how Jesus is the Son of God, and that's the first leg of the three-legged stool. But in this session we've seen why Jesus, as the Messiah, died on the cross as a ransom for many. And that's the second leg. So for homework before next time, please read Mark chapters 6 to 11 and jot down any questions to ask either the person who invited you on this course or send them in to that email address, emmanuel.leftwich@gmail.com. And I look forward to seeing you in session 3. Thank you.